I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Putin makes his first visit to Kursk after the Kremlin erroneously claimed all Ukrainian soldiers have been pushed out, we look at the latest deep strikes on Russian infrastructure, hear from an ambulance convoy in Ukraine, and speak to a central advisor of the EU on Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 21st of May, 3 years and 87 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, dialing in live from Ukraine, former Assistant Administrator of USAID and founder of the non-profit Ukraine Focus, Brock Bierman, and later, Bob Dean, head of the security unit of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. But first, over to Dom for the latest on military developments.
Thanks, Francis. Well, let's start in Ukraine, then move out from there. You'll see why I've done it in that order in a moment. So yesterday in Ukraine, minor Russian advances in the Donbass again, as has been the pattern of the last few weeks. This is to the southwest of Konstantinivka, where their main effort seems to have been over the last few weeks. Now, also yesterday, Russian missile strike against a shooting range, a military range in Sumy Oblast, killed 6 Armed Forces personnel, injured over 10. In a statement, the National Guard said an official investigation into the tragedy is underway, and then added the commander of the unit has been suspended and the necessary information has been passed to law enforcement agencies. There's a suggestion that the training serial had violated directives about how you should conduct such stuff in the presence of an air threat, and violated protocols for avoiding, for example, the unnecessary concentration of personnel. Now, elsewhere across the country, strikes killed 2 civilians, injured at least 23 yesterday, 76 Russian drones fired. However, Ukraine's General Staff statistics notable. There were fewer than 1,000 Russian casualties yesterday. 980 is what they're putting out. And as I say, they are generally seen to be accurate. That's the second time in the week that has happened. Now, freelance journalist Tim White said that that takes the daily mean for May now at the lowest level since last July. I don't doubt Tim's maths. I just didn't have time to go back through all the General Staff statistics to work that one out. So I think Tim's going to be good for the money there. Now then, it's been reported this morning that Russia's building up its forces in the Kharkiv region, obviously on the Russian side of the bordering Kharkiv region. This comes from Andrei Promebus, who's the Chief of Staff of Ukraine's 13th National Guard Brigade, the Khatir Brigade. Now, speaking to Suspilna, the online media platform, he said that Russia's trying to move forces closer to the contact line, but has so far failed to cross the border or carry out any attacks. He said there is an accumulation of personnel closer to the state border. That is, there are attempts to involve the Russian personnel, obviously preparing for active assault operations. Our defence forces are ready to repel attacks. Now then, into Russia. And yesterday, 10 Ukrainian drones hit Russia's Bolkov semiconductor plant in Oryol Oblast. That's a producer of spare parts for Sukhoi jets and Iskander and Kinzhal ballistic missiles. This comes from Ukraine's General Staff this morning. Now, the Bolkov plant that has been sanctioned by the US since last year over its part in the Russian military-industrial complex. That's to the northeast of Ukraine, about halfway to Moscow, so a few hundred kilometers into Russia. Russia says it shot down over 150 Ukrainian drones last night in multiple regions, including 53 in Oryol Oblast. The Ukrainian Telegram channel Supernova Plus shared what it claimed to be footage of the burning and damaged facility. A lot of this reporting is from the Kyiv Independent. They say that and we agree, neither they nor we can verify that information. But there is a number of sites carrying social media imagery that you'll be able to see. The factory is thought to supply at least 19 Russian plants involved in the production of Sukhoi warplanes and the Iskander and Kinzhal ballistic missiles. The Ukrainian military says that despite sanctions, this place produces over 3 million devices a year. Now, then Putin apparently has visited Kursk Oblast, the Kremlin reported this morning. We're not exactly sure when, they didn't give a date, but it's the second time he's been there since Ukraine invaded in August last year. He made his last trip in March. This would be the first time since Moscow declared on April the 26th that they had retaken all of the area from Ukrainian forces, although Kyiv disputes that claim, saying fighting is still ongoing in some areas. Apparently, during the visit, he met with the acting governor, Alexander Kinstein there, the head of local municipalities and members of volunteer organisations. He also visited the Kursk nuclear power plant. And despite Moscow's declaration of victory in the region, Putin did say, actually, on April the 30th, that remnants, his word, remnants of Ukrainian forces remain in Kursk Oblast. Now, just finally, it's essentially breaking news, because I was keeping up to date with it as of about 30 minutes ago when I looked away, but I can't source it very widely. So there's a health warning on this. But it's being reported this morning for a number of sources, including Tim White, I do believe in, the freelance journalist, but I've not seen it elsewhere or in many other places. There seems to be something happening in Russia's Bryansk region. Now, Tim and others have posted photos from a town called Vigonichi. That's about 20 km north of Ukraine inside Russia. There are reports, rumours of a Ukrainian sabotage group in the area, and gun battles have been reported. Now, mobile internet services have been switched off in a number of regions in southwest Russia, and in Lipetsk Oblast, that's kind of two oblasts east of Bryansk. Authorities there are saying that the internet outage is due to actions of the Russian military. Now, reports say 3 Ukrainian drones have appeared in Bryansk region over the town of Sevsk, but that's about 70 k's from where this, whatever is happening, this armed battle, this rumour of an armed battle is thought to be taking place. Now, at least one Moscow airport has been closed. Sheremetyevo is diverting incoming flights, preventing takeoffs, presumably because of the threat from drones. And then 30 minutes ago, like I say, that was when I had to turn away from it, Bryansk governor Alexander Bogomaz put out a statement saying that the actions, including roadblocks, were not because of a search for saboteurs, but because law enforcement and special services were carrying out preventive measures. No further details offered on what those preventive measures were, why they were necessary, numbers of enemy location targets, anything like that. As I say, I put it at the end of the updates because it is a major health warning on it in terms of sourcing and breaking news. So always confusing when these things are breaking as we come on air. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. Trump's stance couldn't be more advantageous to Moscow. The president is our ideological partner. Just breathe in the smell of the New World Order. Just some of the headlines in the Russian press this morning. That's coming from the BBC's Steve Rosenberg in the aftermath of Putin visiting Kursk Oblast for the first time. The Russians are selling this week as a major victory for them diplomatically, but there is considerable debate today among Ukraine's allies as to the ramifications of Trump's call with Putin. On the one hand, pessimists point to the news that the US opposed including the words further support for Ukraine in a G7 statement currently being drafted by finance ministers in Canada. Washington is also apparently reluctant to describe Russia's invasion of Ukraine as illegal in that text, 2 officials involved in the negotiations told Politico. But on the other hand, the remarks by Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday in a hearing were better than people anticipated. He said, and I quote, "The US hasn't decided yet whether to approve new military aid to Ukraine, but the US has not stopped weapon deliveries. Ukraine urgently needs additional Patriot air defense systems, but the US and its allies face shortages. We can't produce them quickly enough, and ammunition is consumed faster than we can replenish. The US is working closely, therefore, with NATO allies that possess Patriot batteries to arrange their transfer to Ukraine." Later, Rubio said this: "The core problem in Ukraine is that Russia wants territory it doesn't have and has no right to, while Ukraine wants territory it can't recover militarily. Trump made no concessions to Russia. The president believes that threatening sanctions would only cause the Russians to stop talking. It's crucial to maintain dialogue and compel them to come to the negotiating table." So a mixed picture indeed. And the New York Times also speaks to that in an interesting piece where they speak to sources close to the calls between Trump and Putin and Trump and European leaders in the last few days. The Times writes, "The subtext is that the era of American expenditures of diplomatic energy, new arms for Ukraine, and economic sanctions against Russia is coming to an end. Several European officials said the message they took was that they should not expect the US to join them anytime soon in piling additional financial pressure onto Putin. For Trump, that is a reversal. In social media posts in recent months, he episodically threatened tariffs and sanctions against Russia if it refused to join Ukraine in declaring a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. A senior European official who has been involved in closed-door discussions said Trump never seemed invested in joining sanctions on Russia if it refused to go along with the unconditional ceasefire. His threats, the official said, appeared largely performative. The US did not join in the design of major new sanctions. The disagreement between the Americans and the Europeans over support for Ukraine will likely come to a head over two nearly back-to-back summits. The G7 in Canada in mid-June, and the NATO summit a week later in The Hague. That second summit in particular will deal with long-term backing for Ukraine and steps to contain Russian forces so that they do not challenge a weaker member of the Atlantic Alliance, and test whether Trump would come to that member's aid under the NATO treaty. So that's the New York Times' assessment. While many will find that dispiriting, it bears repeating that this is far from the worst-case scenario many feared, that of a complete America shut off of aid and intelligence within weeks of the inauguration. This more protracted withdrawal, if indeed that is what we're seeing, allows for Europe to, in theory, build replacement capacity for Patriots and other weapons, while US resources and intelligence are still being funneled in, albeit more slowly. Crucially, if we end up with the US not obstructing the reuse of US weapons purchased by allies in Ukraine, then many experts believe Europe is in a position to keep Ukraine in the fight at a similar level with time. That would explain why so many European leaders are bending over backwards to appease Trump, even if they know the writing is on the wall, and I'm not saying they all do, by the way. They are keeping the taps running. And that is precious. And people in Ukraine tell you that is precious. Now, in our paper, former Defence Secretary here in Britain, Ben Wallace, has written an interesting piece on the subject of intelligence sharing specifically, also speaking to how gaps can and are being plugged as the US seemingly withdraws. Data is the new oil, he writes. There are now AI, satellite, and even advertising companies who have data for sale. The one thing all these companies have in common is that they are not the state. They are private, and many of them are vital to the new ways of warfare and intelligence. Not that long ago, spy satellites and data mining were the preserve of governments. Then along came Google Earth. Suddenly nothing was secret. With the right knowledge and expertise, individual capabilities can be woven together to create formidable intelligence, surveillance, and targeting regimes. You can literally buy off the shelf an intelligence agency today, as long as you know where to go shopping. In March, Trump claimed he switched off US intelligence sharing as a way of bullying Zelensky to the table. His bold statements, while causing short-term harm, also exposed his ignorance of modern warfare. Supportive allies and companies soon stepped into the gap. If Tesco can switch suppliers in a matter of hours, so too can armies. General Sir Nick Carter used to say, when he was chief of the defence staff, that the modern battlefield is about hiding and finding. Ukraine's challenge isn't finding Russians. It is having enough shells, drones, missiles, and effects to deal with them. I believe Europe and the UK can provide that if the US won't. So Ben Wallace there, and we'll link to that piece in the Telegraph in the show notes. Another key metric in warfare is morale, of course. And just to wrap up, while we regularly focus on Ukrainian resolve, it is far harder to come by accurate information from the Russian armed forces. Here too, the New York Times has an interesting piece this week, citing several interviews with Russian soldiers who, they say, fought in different units and different areas and spoke with deep bitterness about their country's officials and civilians, whom they accuse of benefiting from the war while ignoring frontline hardships. Their comments point to the difficulties Russia would face after any peace deal in integrating servicemen back into civilian life and in moving the wartime economy back onto civilian footing. Some of the interviewed soldiers struggled to reconcile their personal desire for peace and exhaustion with the war with the need to make sense of their personal sacrifices through a victorious outcome. Russian opinion surveys show that such a truce would also fail to satisfy a large part of Russian society. Years of war propaganda and steady, if slow, battlefield gains have convinced many Russians that their country is fighting an existential conflict against the West, which will not end until Ukrainian capitulation. So we'll add to a link to that piece too. For me, there are two major takeaways from that which bode ill for the idea that Moscow will stop this war unless it is forced to. First, the immense challenge of shifting from a war footing to a civilian one in a dictatorship, and the threats therein for a regime of doing so, which Russia, of course, experienced multiple times in its history. This is what we mean when we talk about the systems of being, or about systems in a country being programmed for conquest, and why it makes a lasting peace exceedingly difficult until a country is compelled to stop and effective deterrents are in place. The other concern is simply the indoctrination of Russian servicemen and women, and similar ramifications because of that. But those are our updates today. And turning to our guests now, listeners may recall that around this time last year, for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, I joined a convoy of ambulances sourced and delivered for the front lines by the non-profit organisation Ukraine Focus, with each of them saving hundreds of lives over the course of their life. We then caught up with that team again when we were in Kyiv in November as they made their latest delivery. And on the episode today, dialing in from the road in Ukraine, we're joined again by founder and CEO Brock Bierman, who formerly served as assistant administrator of USAID in Trump's first term as president. Brock, welcome back to the podcast. We'll come to President Trump and the situation in the US shortly. It'll be interesting to hear your perspective. But first of all, just tell us about the latest mission delivering ambulances.
Great. We're just west of Zhytomyr. We've already put thousands of kilometers on 22 vehicles, getting them from all over Europe to Kyiv. We will have a handover tomorrow in Kyiv to a number of different territorial defense force brigades and units. And we've got a very successful mission with 25 volunteers that came from everywhere from the United States to Canada to the UK, Germany, and Poland. We've got a real alliance. And this particular convoy and this mission is dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and the show of alliance that defeats evil. And I think, again, that goes back to the convoy that you were back on in June of last year.
Well, it's great to hear that the missions are still going ahead. And what's the general atmosphere where you are, Brock? I mean, how have you found this mission compared to previous ones as you've been traveling across Europe and indeed across Ukraine?
Well, look, I've been continually impressed by the united front that Ukrainians have, specifically on the local level. They are fatigued, they are tired, but they are resolved. I think that they are focused and they are resolute in their fight. And we are going to continue to support them until this war is over, until they no longer need the ambulances, until they no longer need the services that we're helping them with. But again, the fact that they are committed, the fact that they are united is impressive, specifically when I just talk to everyday average Ukrainians.
Now, Brock, we're focused on ambulances here, and you and I have spoken about their significance many times, so I won't repeat that here today. But before we came on air, you were telling me about a particular truck, a Zelensky truck. It sounds like a fascinating story. If you could just fill in listeners on this and the story relating to that.
Certainly, and I just want to remind everyone that every ambulance saves about 250 lives every month. And we are now delivering our over 275th ambulance. And you think about over the last 3 years, what that means in terms of tens of thousands of lives that have been saved. We're fortunate enough to be able to get President Zelensky's truck from Servant of the People. So just a real quick background, he drove a red Chevrolet in the show. That truck was actually made for the United States. It was driven in the United States, and then it was sent to Ukraine. And after it was sent to Ukraine, it was put on the television show. and he drove it up until it was actually the show was off. He became president. It was in storage. Then he took it out of storage, and when the war started, auctioned it off. It went to the front lines. It got painted. It was red. It got painted camouflage green, and then it got shot up, and there's bullet holes and shrapnel in it. And then we ended up buying it after it was destroyed. We fixed it back up, put a new engine in it, send it to America, and we're going to take it on a tour across the United States, from Virginia, Washington, D.C., north to Boston, across the country through Detroit, Chicago, all of those the different states down to Arizona, where we're going to hopefully auction it off this fall. People can read more about it at our website, ukrainefocus.org, Zelensky truck. But that truck will be ultimately auctioned off to raise money to buy more ambulances, Francis.
Well, we'll have a link in the show notes to some more information about that, and indeed to your organisation for those who are interested in learning more. As I hadn't heard of this, so I thought it was really interesting when you were telling me about it earlier on. But Brock, before you go, just interested in your assessment at the moment of the US situation, really. As I say, you've got experience with USAID, and obviously we've seen quite a sharp decline in support for Ukraine and other European causes that was funded by that, as well as some of the situations we were talking about earlier on in the episode with the United States at the moment. I think it's fair to say, I don't think I'm being unfair to say this, Brock, you were more of an optimist with regard to the ramifications of a Trump presidency were he to win, and as he did win in the end when we last spoke. So I wonder what your assessment is now we've seen things shift over the last few weeks.
Yeah, look, I think as we talked before Trump was elected, we talked about what his agenda might be. And frankly speaking, from my perspective, his agenda is one of, look, from my perspective, his agenda is trying to end the war. I'm from a nonprofit, Francis. I know it's a difficult circumstance to be in, to try to stay out of the political dialogue. But at the end of the day, the president keeps his cards close to his vest. He's not really sharing how he intends to end this war. I know that's not really good answers, but I'm hopeful that the war will end by the end of the year. We will, again, I'm basically spending all of my time keeping my head down, trying to raise funds for the organization to try to deliver more ambulances. There's never been a more important time to deliver ambulances than right now. I would just say this, it's a very complicated time. And I understand the perspective of wanting to end the bloodshed, but I also understand that the bloodshed is for democracy, it's for rule of law, and we need to do whatever we can to continue to support Ukraine, the people who are fighting every day, and we're going to continue to do that. In terms of Trump, time will tell as to whether or not this war will end soon. I would like to have seen a quicker end to the war, but ultimately, here we are, and we're working toward what we can do personally as a private organization. And I'll just end with this, Francis. We have seen an increase in donations from the private sector since the United States has pulled out of USAID or MCC or the other organizations that have provided foreign assistance. It's not going to be enough, obviously, but we are going to continue to do what we can, as small as it is, to continue to make sure that the United States on a private sector is involved in as much as we can be on a day-to-day basis. And I'll just point to the fact that we've got allies from all countries around the world, and they continue to give us support.
Hi, Brock. It's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you just dial us into where you are? Take us into the country. So you've described where you are now, but can you tell us a little bit, if you're able, about where you're heading to next, what the roads are looking like? You're obviously driving great distances, so you're filling up with fuel. Just give us a feel on what it's like. Is there any kind of rationing? When you fill up, are you limited by how many litres you're able to shove in the tank or anything like that? And what's the kind of experience? Because my experience of the service stations out there was that they're much better than British service stations in terms of getting snacks and drinks and all that kind of stuff. And what's the everyday life like on the road?
So everyday life on the road, at least between here and Kyiv, is pretty functional. There's still a lot of damage that occurred from the beginning of the war. There's a large section of the main highway leading west into Kyiv that's still closed off. We just passed it. But ordinarily, the roads are pretty good. People are moving anywhere from 60 to 70 miles an hour. They're following the speed limits. They are gassing up. There's food. There's definitely supplies in this section of the country, clearly. And people are able to move about freely and without any type of hindrance. But again, obviously, in the western part of the country, it's not suffering as much in terms of the problems that they're having. I haven't seen any problems up until this journey this time.
Well, thanks very much, Brock, for your time today and for dialing in. I know it's always busy from my experience when you last time. It's a frenetic day, so much appreciated. Let's go to our final thoughts now, and I'll come back to you, Brock, in a moment. Dom, where do you want to leave listeners?
I just want to talk about the newsletter. We've recently launched a Ukraine the Latest newsletter. It's going to come out every week. It's from Francis and me, taking it in turns, although I see he's volunteered me for this week's again, answering questions, giving a few other thoughts, that kind of stuff. You can sign up on the website and all that kind of jazz. Anyway, we've had a few messages from people who are having trouble signing up. So we went and had a chat with our tech team, and they say if you are having problems signing up, probably the most common reasons for this is that you might have signed up too late to receive that week's newsletter. It goes out at about 2:30 in the afternoon, Friday afternoon, London time. So if you sign up, I think they said to me something like within 6 hours of that, you're unlikely to get that week's newsletter. So that might be part of it. But also, they said the most common reason, and this is across all newsletters here at the Telegraph, is that if you have had any interactions with the paper before about any other newsletters or any other competitions or anything like that, and you've ticked the box saying you're opting out of any future emails from the Telegraph, that will then stop you from getting a newsletter, even if you sign up separately. They're almost like two separate systems. There's different ways in and different ways out, if you get what I mean. Anyway, I'm told you're able to get back into your account and change that preference and untick that box. If you do that and you're still having problems, we can change that from our end. So do let us know, ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, if you're still having problems signing up for the newsletter. Otherwise, please have a read. Let us know what you think. Ask us some questions. Get involved. Cheers.
Well, thanks, Dom, and thanks to, the thousands of you who've signed up to the newsletter. It's all free for non-subscribers to the Telegraph as well. So literally all you need to do is sign up and that's it. We've really loved, I think it's fair to say, getting your messages over the last few weeks, and especially glad that you're finding the diagrams of weapons interesting, the maps of some of the front lines, and of course answering your questions. We'll have a link in the show notes for those of you who wish to sign up to that, but just to say we really appreciate it, and our intention is not to just summarize the week's reporting. It's not that kind of newsletter. It's designed to expand on our coverage, and I know Dom in this week's is going to talk a little bit more about his trip to Estonia, a bit more behind the scenes footage. So, do check that out. But Brock, I know that you're very appreciative of the listeners to this podcast who've contributed to you and to the project over the last year or so. But where do you want to leave listeners on some of the subjects we've reflected on today?
Listen, Francis, this is what I can say. I think that Trump is unpredictable. I think he always has been. If I fumbled the answer or the question that you asked, there's no doubt about it. But simply put, he holds his cards close to the vest. But I will tell you this. I do think that Putin is taking advantage of every opportunity he can. He's a pathological liar. He's a war criminal. He needs to be stopped, and we need to take him seriously, and we need to do everything that we can. And I will do everything that I can to urge my colleagues, my friends, to support Ukraine and push for more United States action in this particular circumstance. And we have to understand that Putin's long game is not going to stop in Ukraine.
While in Estonia, Dom spoke to Bob Dean, the head of the security unit of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendahl, and coordinator of the Russia and Eastern Europe Centre. He is one of the leading Dutch think tank experts on Eastern Europe. As a representative of the Klingendahl Institute, he is a central advisor to the European Union on the potential Ukraine-Russia peace negotiations. This is their conversation.
I'm delighted now to be joined by Bob Dean, a security and Eastern Europe expert at the Netherlands Institute for International Relations. Bob, thank you so much for making the time to talk to Ukraine the Latest. Now, I'd like to talk about two things in particular. The relationship between Europe and Ukraine vis-a-vis membership of the EU, and also the negotiations currently ongoing.
Okay.
But first of all, one of the points that's been made from a number of speakers, mainly from the US, over this conference has been, if Europe loves Ukraine so much, then why the hell aren't you going to make it a member of the EU as soon as you can? What are the impediments at the moment to Ukrainian membership of the EU?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's also one that Ukrainians are asking very actively, because, of course, the Ukrainian view is that they fought for their place in Europe by defending Europe with their own lives, and they should just join the European Union as quickly as possible. And the EU has actually, if you look back on other enlargement processes, it has done some exceptional things for Ukraine, including granting it the candidate status fairly quickly. But there is, of course, a lot of different views within the European Union on how that process should unfold. And let me just outline, if that's okay with you, a couple of options that the EU has at its disposal. The first one is to do what the Ukrainians ask and just let Ukraine in really quickly. Like a big bang enlargement theory, you would have Ukraine on board without all the reforms being done, but the EU would be stronger because it would have strong and economically powerful Ukraine and a Ukrainian military in it in the long run.
So sidestep all the processes that would be expected ordinarily and just say extraordinary times, call for extraordinary measures. Ukraine, next Tuesday, you're in.
Yeah. So sometimes you could see it as the Greek model, because that's what the then European community, the EU then did at that time. But that was like in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So different context. There's a lot of objections to this. It is also called the shortcut. So Ukraine would want a shortcut into the EU because it would deprive Ukraine of having to do all these reforms that are actually really important to improve its governance and its economy. And there's no consensus on this at all among EU member states. Many are very skeptical about this. So that leaves you with option 2, and that is to put Ukraine through the ringer of the whole process. The whole enlargement EU process is actually very complicated, and it's been made more and more complicated over the years because many EU member states are not very keen on enlarging the European Union anymore. So the bar is very high, it's very technical as well, and there's a real risk if you do that for Ukraine that it will lose interest. Because it's almost impossible to do for any country at this point in time. But in a country that has just gone through this war, it's even harder to do. So there's a real risk of frustration from both sides if you do that full process.
Well, if you think it's tough getting into the EU, you should try going the other way.
Well, it's also what I'm trying to tell the Ukrainians, that you're trying to join an organization that has some serious internal problems. And the EU is very internally focused on all kinds of reform questions. And in the meanwhile, the Ukrainians are knocking on the door and they want to join it for another reason. It's not just about money or the internal market, but for them, the EU is a civilizational choice, very principled, which is why the third option that is actually most often discussed, and it's sometimes called phased integration or a la carte integration or a very selective, tailor-made approach for Ukraine, where it gets certain things from the EU, but not all of the things. That is actually the most feasible for Ukraine, and it would do most justice to the situation it's in. But Ukrainians would perceive it as a second-class membership, and therefore, at a more emotional and principled level, they really don't like it. But otherwise, if they're not willing to go down that path, then everything has to be solved, including very complex things like the common agricultural policy, defense policy, all kinds of things where Ukraine would put real challenges to the EU to actually function if Ukraine would join it.
And which of those three is currently leading the pack at the moment in terms of support from other members, but also which one most pragmatically looks most likely to succeed?
Now, the formal role, the formal position of the EU is the number 2, that Ukraine has to go through the full process, every single chapter, open it, close it, do all the reforms, but with real assistance. So compared to other countries, especially from Western Balkans, where the EU is not so keen, there the EU largely expects them to do this themselves and just very critically evaluates it, as the European Commission does. With Ukraine, everybody understands that it also really needs help to meet these targets. So Ukraine gets a lot of goodwill and a lot of assistance. But still, and here comes a very painful obstacle that's going to be there, a lot of countries will take the opportunity of this process and will use it to demand things of Ukraine in their bilateral relationship, especially countries that border Ukraine and that have some historical issues with it. Hungary, case in point, it wants all kinds of things on the Hungarian minority. Poland has historical issues over Volyn. Maybe if in Romania, Simeon wins the elections looking forward, he might also have demands on Romanian language and things like that. So countries will be very difficult to Ukraine in that accession process. And it may make that frustration even greater, which is why I think that other process, the phased process where Ukraine gets immediate benefits if it meets immediate targets, that is probably more feasible.
Okay. Now, I've heard it said that this never-ending discussion about Ukraine joining EU and NATO, to be fair, sends a sign of weakness to Russia. Do you think that's the case?
I think it's something Russia is very keen on exploiting. So if you look at Russian strategic narratives towards Ukraine and also towards other countries that want to join the EU, like Georgia and Moldova, you very often see two recurrent themes in it. One is, why do you want to join this weak, feminine, degenerate Europe? So it very much appeals to more social conservatism and religious values. That's the story of Gay Europa, which Russians like to use. And the second story, which is even more nefarious, is they don't really want you. You should be better off with us because these Europeans are lying to you. They don't want to have you. They'll just make it impossible for you. Just wait and see. They're not really your friends. And Russia gets proven right, unfortunately, sometimes by the way the EU operates. So a country like North Macedonia, which has been wanting to join for a very long time, then just first it gets blackmailed by Greece and it solves the issue with Greece. And then it gets blackmailed by Bulgaria. And this is very frustrating. The same for Serbia. So countries eventually might turn against the EU. And this is also what you see happening in Georgia at the moment.
So is that the institutional vulnerability at the heart of the EU? That the fact that there is so much politics, there are so many nations, there's so many different ways, so many different avenues of attack for a mischievous actor?
Absolutely. And since this accession process goes by consensus, so the opening and the closing of the chapters, all of the EU member states need to agree all the time. So a country like Hungary has dozens, I forgot how many, but really many moments when it can veto something. And that means Ukraine is vulnerable to this sort of blackmail at many points. But it also shows something else, and that is that the EU is actually an actor that was created for peacetime. It is meant to be almost a secretariat of a single market and a community of values and a bureaucratic machine. But it's now being put to the test. Can it operate in such a tough geopolitical environment when there are other actors, and it's not only Russia, that are really challenging it and that will abuse these type of things, this type of internal disagreements to weaken the EU?
Does it recognise that it's facing this test, that it, as you say, built for peacetime, but now finds itself in a major war on European soil?
I think that the leaders of the EU do. And if you look at the way that some of them operate, including now recently together with the United Kingdom, which actually makes me very happy that there's now a European approach towards security and not just an EU approach towards security. I think some of the leaders do, but then their populations are mostly still concerned with domestic issues, with economic issues. I found it, for example, a very good example that now the UK is really joining forces with the Germans and the French and on this question on European security, but in the meanwhile gets into an argument with, I think, Sweden over fishing rights. Such a pity that these sort of narrow interests take over this sort of broader geopolitical aims of building a prosperous and secure Europe as a whole. And Ukraine also falls victim to this.
Now, turning to the negotiations, as in not negotiations about Ukraine joining the EU, but these actual peace negotiations. How involved have you been with that? And what is there any kind of structure that you're trying to follow at the moment? Any plan that you're working to, or is it just trying to react to the last thing that Donald Trump said and hope for the best?
No, the work that I do I'm the coordinator of a group of experts who support Ukraine and other countries with achieving a just and sustainable end to this war. And it came forth out of something that the Ukrainians called the Ukrainian peace formula. It was their vision for peace. And in that vision was a 10th point. It was a 10-point plan. And the last point was the idea that this war needs to really end with a peace agreement, not just with a ceasefire that gets broken later, not just with a fudge, but actually it has to be really solved. Now, in order to do that, you really need to build a very complex process of negotiations. You can't really do that the way Donald Trump is trying to do it, just stop the killing. Within 24 hours, 100 days, a couple months, you have to actually do the hard work of identifying what are the real problems and what are we willing to do about them. And when you do that work, you notice very quickly that what Russia is asking is really incompatible with what Ukraine is able and willing to do. So ever since, we've been trying to help find ways to achieve at least war termination, so putting an end to the war, for which you do need a robust ceasefire, but all of this stuff needs to be properly negotiated. So a lot of the work that we do is also giving expertise to the negotiators that if you want a ceasefire, then you need to have certain elements. It's very hard to have a ceasefire without clear delineation of the line of contact or with a monitoring mechanism if there's no accountability for ceasefire violations. So the type of work we do is drawing on expertise from other regions and other historical moments, including actually between Ukraine and Russia earlier already, to give that advice. Yeah.
And how is that even possible if there's just a fundamental disagreement about why the war started? Every time Putin talks about these negotiations, he goes on about the root causes of the conflict, and that's not recognised by Ukraine or the wider West. I don't even think it's recognised by
the White House. So how can you even get past the first step?
No, because you can't really get to a sustainable peace when these are the actual positions of the parties, because what Putin demands of Ukraine is effectively disarmament. He wants to have a full control over it. Not necessarily full territorial control, but also politically. He has really demands on the way Ukrainians run their country and remember their history. So that bit is absolutely incompatible, but that doesn't mean that the war can't be stopped, because you can stop a war without achieving a full peace. Because if you really want to talk about the fundamentals of what a just peace would be, you would also have to have some sort of accountability and, even harder at some point, some reconciliation. Now, no one really considers that within the realm of the possible in the near future. So what we are discussing is a more robust way of war termination and also preventing that the war starts again very soon, so non-recurrence. And that you can achieve if there's a combination of a stable ceasefire, some form of guarantees or assurances that make it harder for Russia to attack Ukraine again. Also vice versa, making sure that Ukraine doesn't immediately break the agreement either. And for that, you need a number of things. And I think that is not impossible. It just looks very distant still for now.
And have you detected any sign from the Russian side that they are willing to approach negotiations as an honest actor?
No, not yet. I think what we've seen happening now in Istanbul, to me, doesn't entirely seem to be in good faith. This seems to be largely in response to pressure put by President Trump. He did achieve something that President Biden didn't achieve, which is getting the parties to at least talk about talking. Because if you look at peace processes or negotiations, they go through a number of phases. And the first one is that they start talking about negotiations. That wasn't even happening. Both sides basically said not much to talk about. Ukraine also didn't really want to negotiate until it had a stronger position, because it knew what was going to happen, namely what happens now. Russia will just impose conditions or try to impose. So President Trump created a new sort of dynamic in the process that made both Ukraine and Russia try, at least to pretend that they wanted to talk, in order to win over Trump to their side. And that has actually achieved something, because if you pretend to want to negotiate, then you also have to start to think about what you would want to negotiate about. So there has been some movement. It's not completely deadlocked. But unfortunately, what we saw happening in Istanbul is that President Trump said fairly shortly before talks would begin that nothing would change until he saw President Putin personally. And that even removed any incentive from Russia to try and pretend that they were interested. And therefore, they just dictated some terms to Ukraine.
And there's been no further movement on that. We've got no date for Putin and Trump to meet or anything like that, have we? So the whole process is stalled until that point, I presume?
Yes. And what's happening is, in other contexts as well, what President Trump was going for was actually a form of imposed ceasefire. So the sides didn't really want to stop fighting, because Ukraine doesn't feel that it's just that 20% of its territory keeps being occupied. It wanted actually a stronger position. And Russia still thinks that it can win. So the sides didn't really achieve a deadlock or a mutually hurting stalemate on the battlefield. It was instead President Trump who said, time to stop the killing, otherwise I will do certain things. And to Ukraine, he actually really put pressure by stopping also the weapons and the intel for a little while. So Ukraine was forced in a position where it would actually have to comply with what Trump was asking. But he never really put that pressure on Russia. Until a certain point when he started to issue fairly strong statements that he felt that Putin might be tapping him along. He was showing impatience. And suddenly you see the Russians think that, okay, it's time to start at least playing along a little bit. And then some movement came, and then they were willing to go and meet. But then you saw very quickly Putin backtracking, not wanting to come in person. So there wasn't really a clear ripeness, a moment for this conflict to be seriously resolved.
So there's still no real good faith from either side, really. But neither wants to negotiate now.
Well, the Ukrainians are earnest when they say they want that 30-day ceasefire, because that 30-day ceasefire without conditions, that would create some space to actually start talking about real negotiations. And you see that very often in processes, that sides first agree on a preliminary ceasefire without any monitoring or without any conditions linked to it, in order to give themselves the possibility to really negotiate. So Ukraine said, fine, we're willing to go along with this, even if they're super skeptical that Russians might not even comply with the ceasefire. But they also haven't really articulated a vision on what they would consider a fair outcome, because that is their peace formula. It's still the same position, actually, that Ukrainians want, which for Russians amounts to basically giving up altogether. So what the Ukrainians would like to happen would mean the Russians really lost the war. And what the Russians would want to happen would mean the Ukrainians really capitulate. So they are still in fairly maximalist positions, but to be fair, it is the Ukrainians who've moved quite a lot, mostly due to heavy pressure by the Americans.
Which takes us back to that enforced ceasefire, as you said. Any historical examples of where that works?
There's places where it works, but then usually countries would also, those who imposed the ceasefire would also put troops to enforce it. So, and all kinds of examples. Northern Cyprus, the UK and the UN would play a role. In North and South Korea, there's actually US troops being stationed there. So there's very few examples that I can think of that are in an interstate context, because there's many examples of domestic sort of civil war-like scenarios. But this is not a civil war, where the sides with large modern militaries were told to stop fighting by an outside actor that then did nothing to enforce that. Because actually, when you look at it, and it's not a very optimistic example, the strongest parallel I can see here is actually India and Pakistan. Two countries with large militaries who can inflict serious damage on each other, who only wanted to have a ceasefire because it was in both of their interests. There's no outside party that can really enforce that ceasefire. And I think that's very similar, unfortunately, to what is happening now between Ukraine and Russia. There is almost no one who wants to put their troops in between those two armies. So even when Europeans discussed a peacekeeping force, I don't think they ever seriously considered putting serious numbers of troops in between the Ukrainians and the Russians to enforce it.
And the talk now of this coalition of the willing, troops or military assets, aircraft and maritime ships and whatever in the Black Sea, that's being described as a reassurance force. So absolutely not a peacekeeping force holding the two sides apart.
No, and it's evolved over the months, because at the very beginning, I was present at the Munich Security Conference when the US envoy, General Kellogg, articulated the need for such a deterrent. And he basically said, if you have such an agreement, then it needs to be backed up by lethal force if there's a violation, something along these immediate and lethal force. That was not actually what the European countries were willing to do on their own, because that's quite a risky venture. That means that you're willing to actually join the Ukrainians in their war against the Russian Federation if Russia violates the agreement. So then we saw a couple of weeks of the Europeans trying to find out what the Americans are willing to contribute and if they're willing to give this backstop. Remember the famous discussion of the backstop, which, if you look at it from a slight distance, actually means that the Europeans would give a security guarantee to Ukraine and the Americans would give a security guarantee to the Europeans, and therefore indirectly to the Ukrainians. And President Trump has made it quite clear that is not going to happen. And the Europeans have scaled back their ambition ever since. So currently discussions are largely on how Europe can help the Ukrainians, who are the primary deterrent, they are defending their own country, to do that, rather than fight alongside them against Russia.
So you say we're in phase one at the moment, these talks about talks, but by God, it sounds as if there's a huge distance to go before there's anything meaningful happens here. All that you've just outlined there, it sounds, at the moment, impossible.
Well, this war has been going on for quite a long time. If you zoom out, it's actually been since 2014. So there's no real reason why it should be concluded, as President Trump wanted, within days or months. It will go on as long as one of the sides thinks that they have a chance to win on the battlefield. So this is a conclusion of it, the interlinkages between what happens on the battlefield and the negotiation table. Right now, there's no imminent need for the Russians to stop fighting. They have the upper hand. It's not a big upper hand. It's not as if they can steamroll over the Ukrainians.
I heard it described as, now where was it? Checking my notes here. Somebody said Russia and Ukraine are both losing. It's just that Russia is losing more slowly.
That is actually a very good way of summarizing it. And as long as that's the case, so it's basically a war of attrition, then Russia thinks of it in relative terms. So they have the upper hand over the Ukrainians. I think it's not very unlikely that a moment is going to come that changes, that dynamic. It depends on the amount of Western support to Ukraine. It depends on battlefield conditions. But there may well be a moment when Russia realizes there's nothing more to gain for us by continuing these attacks. And then you reach what in literature is sometimes, it's a contentious term, but it's referred to as a mutually hurting stalemate. That actually for both sides, fighting is worse than a ceasefire. And then they might well come to an agreement. But if you don't resolve the underlying problems, these incompatible positions with Russia wanting control over Ukraine and Ukraine wanting to be a sovereign state with its own national identity and culture, as long as these are incompatible, there's always a risk that the war resumes. And that makes me sometimes refer to this war as almost an existential conflict. And there are other examples of existential conflicts, and they usually get resolved only with war termination. So the war stops and there's a ceasefire that can hold for a long time. But they can always flare up again, as we see between India and Pakistan.
And just finally, next calendar date that we should be keeping an eye out for, or are we waiting to hear about this Putin-Trump meeting?
Yes, it's Putin-Trump meeting. That's of crucial importance. I mean, being from the Netherlands and living in The Hague, for me, the NATO summit is a key moment. And not because we expect anything on Ukrainian prospects to join NATO, but it's usually one of those moments when allies come together and decide really what it is they're willing to do on certain things. That's, of course, a key moment to watch. And I have a suspicion that this is just going to be another hot summer where they keep fighting quite intensely. Because we know also from the past that usually the fighting gets more intense just before a ceasefire if the negotiations come close. Because both sides might want to try and use some of their reserves to still move the front line in their preferred direction if they have the feeling that it might be frozen for a longer period. So what we should also be watching is the intensity of the fighting. And it might well be that Russia tries one more summer offensive to see how far it can get.
Well, thanks so much for talking us through that, and we will stay in touch as things develop.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adimora. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.